In order to understand how to specifically maximize overall joy and to minimize suffering, we must first study, research, and develop the field of moralnetics. Moralnetics is a systematic approach for calculating the amount of joy and suffering produced by each action. It turns the question of ethics from a discussion into a calculation. Moralnetics simplifies all emotions and experiences into two fundamental components: the amount of joy and suffering experienced. The amount of joy and suffering experienced are then quantified into units called joy and suffering units, where one joy unit is equivalent to -1 suffering unit, and vice versa. To help us understand moralnetics, we will start with a simple example and expand from there. In this example, there exists only one being for only one moment in time. We can then choose only one of two scenarios. One scenario where the being gets a car and a wrench, and another scenario where the being gets a tree. How do we determine which scenario maximizes joy? We compare the amount of joy and suffering units produced by each scenario. In this case, giving the being a car and a wrench will give the being 4 joy units, whereas giving him a tree will give the being 3 joy units. In this case, giving the being a car and a wrench produces more joy than giving him a tree. We will now expand our example to include time. This is done by adding the amount of joy produced at each time interval into a new net joy unit value. In this example, the being will experience more joy initially for getting the car and wrench, but less during the next 2 time intervals. However, the being experiences less joy initially for getting the tree, but more joy during the next 2 time intervals. To find out which scenario produces more joy, we add the amount of joy produced at each interval together and compare the net joy or suffering units. In this case, giving the being the car and a wrench will produce 30 joy units, while giving the being the tree will produce 40 joy units. In this case, giving the being a tree will produce more joy than giving the being a car and a wrench. We will now expand our example to include 2 beings for only one moment in time. To find the net joy produced, we add the amount of joy experienced by each being. In this example, we can choose only one of 2 scenarios. One scenario where only the first being gets a car, and another scenario where only the second being gets a car. In this case, giving the first being a car will produce 4 joy units, while giving the second being a car will produce 3 joy units. In this case, giving the first being a car will produce more joy than giving the second being a car. We expand this example by adding the joy experienced by every single being so that we get the net joy experienced by all beings. We will also expand our example to include time. This is done by adding the amount of joy produced at each time interval into a new net joy unit value. To be more precise, we can record every time interval so that we get a continuous graph. If we take the sum of all the amounts of joy produced at each interval, we get the net amount of joy experienced by all beings throughout all of time. This value can be formalized into a mathematical equation as shown. However, experience itself may not be limited to only beings. It might be generated by matter, motion, magnetism, and/or some combination of these and some other physical phenomenons. Thus, the absolute value that should be maximized in order to maximize overall joy and to minimize overall suffering is the value of the last equation, which is the amount of joy experienced by every position in space throughout all of time. However, the first equation can be used until more research is done toward understanding the physical origin of experience and creating advanced ways of producing more joy throughout the universe.